Okay, welcome to the last in this year's series of the Lonergan Workshop's contributions to the Church in the 21st Century Initiative. Before I get started, I have a nice quote from the late John Courtney Murray, which is somehow apropos of Michael's topic. He said, "The basic issues of our time concern the spiritual substance of a free society, as it has historically derived from the central Christian concept, res sacra homo," which he translates, "Man is a sacredness." The basic issues concern the fundamental structure of a free society. I do not mean its legal structure, as constitutionally established. I mean rather the ontological structure of society, of which the constitutional order should be only the reflection. This underlying structure is a matter of theory, that is, it is to be conceived in terms of a theorem with regard to the relation between the sacredness inherent in man and the manifold secularities amid which human life is lived. As you know, Courtney Murray was a very close associate of Lonergan's. He was actually asked, David Tracy told me, to write the achievement of Bernard Lonergan, but since he was ill, he asked David Tracy to write it. And I found out early this year that he was also part of the writing of the German Constitution, which helped them formulate a system in which they have religion in their schools. But more crucially, I want to mention the fact that there has been this construction of Roman Catholicism from 1870 to the Second Vatican Council, which itself has integrated some of the manifold secularities amid which human life is lived, and not least of which of those secularities is what we now know in secular terms as bureaucracy. I remember before I went to Rome as a student in '63, Time magazine had an article in which the church was deemed the most efficient bureaucracy, and General Motors came in second. From what I can tell, we're still in the lead. At any rate, when in the second year of this series we moved from talking about the crisis to looking forward, what could be done, I, at that time, invited Michael to speak, but Michael was heavily engaged in finishing his book on Hannah Arendt and many other things, as well as recovering from a very serious injury. So he begged me to let him wait, and now I'm so glad we did, because, as it were, at the end of a 3-year series, it's like having the best at last. So welcome, Michael.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out on this lovely May day and this very cool May evening. I was saying to Fred when I arrived, I'm going to take a while to get used to those lights. At Vassar, if we tried to schedule a public lecture in May, we would be considered mad. So you're very daring, Fred, to bring an interloper in once classes have ended. And I hope you won't regret your decision to come this evening. Okay. The loss of effective authority, crisis of trust and credibility. I begin with a quotation from the Gospel of Mark, 10:42-45, the Oxford translation. You know that those who rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the servant of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The first section of my talk is entitled Critical Belonging. Let me begin by thanking Boston College and Fred Lawrence for this invitation. I come here in early May as the academic year winds down to speak with you in the spirit of Alexis de Tocqueville. Quote, "Human beings will not receive the truth from their enemies, and it is very rarely offered to them by their friends." Close quote. My hope this evening is to speak the truth in the spirit of friendship. So let us begin with the theme of friendship and then return to what I hope will be the utterance of truth. I am a Catholic Christian. I was raised in a Catholic family, educated in Catholic schools, formed both intellectually and spiritually in Catholic traditions. My Catholic identity is a constitutive part of who I am. My loyalty to the Catholic Church, though profound, is also critical. I was raised to think critically by my father and by the Jesuits who taught me at Fairfield Prep. My liberal education at Notre Dame was conducted in the Socratic spirit of relentless questioning. After studying philosophy at Yale and then teaching it for 37 years at Vassar College, that Socratic spirit has become my second nature. I believe in unrestricted intellectual liberty, the importance of learned ignorance, and the need to combine personal loyalty with critical detachment. To use the idiom of Bernard Herring, my position in the Catholic community is both faithful and free. At its best, the Catholic tradition encourages solidarity with all people, but especially with the estranged and the outcast. The sad chords of estrangement resonate through my remarks today. During the last 40 years, many of the people whom I love most in the world have become alienated from the Catholic Church, no longer finding within it a spiritual home. I am thinking of my siblings, many of our friends, and especially of our children. For each person, of course, the spiritual quest is unique, and every movement from the Church is accompanied by a personal story. But there are common causes to account for this exodus and legitimate concerns underlying this shared disaffection. Naming some of these causes and concerns and speaking truthfully about them to the best of my ability is a large part of my purpose in this lecture. Crises of personal faith are inseparable from belief in an invisible God whom no living person has ever seen. Yet most of those I know who have left the Church have not abandoned the teaching of the gospel. Their discouragement is not with Jesus of Nazareth, but with what I'll call the institutional culture of the Church that claims to speak in his name. In voicing the concerns of the estranged, I am also articulating my own. While I love the Christian gospel and struggle to practice it, I am saddened whenever the conduct of the Church violates the compassionate spirit of its founder. To its honor and credit, the Catholic Church provides a large tent. It is a global community of pilgrims whose common faith is combined with the most remarkable human diversity, personal, cultural, and historical. The seed of the gospel can take root in any heart, in any land, in any era. My ancestors brought their Catholic faith to America from Ireland and Germany. From birth to adulthood, my parents and teachers nurtured its growth. I have modeled my own intellectual life on the example of Catholic thinkers like John Donne, Bernard Lonergan, and Charles Taylor. I have learned from them what it really means to be Catholu, to be open to the whole of human experience, to be committed to a lifelong quest for greater understanding. Part 2, the loss of effective authority. Crisis and renewal are recurrent episodes in the history of the Church. Since its origin in ancient Palestine, Christianity has had to adapt to the unwelcome and the unexpected. The apostles were demoralized by Jesus' passion and crucifixion. Later, their faith and courage were restored through the descent of the Spirit on Pentecost. The early church lived an uneasy coexistence with the Roman Empire and then had to adjust to its newly elevated imperial status. The decline and fall of Rome prompted the rise of the monastic movement. The Latin recovery of Aristotle's writings energized and challenged the medieval universities. The papal scandals of the 14th century gave new life to the Church's conciliar tradition. Even more radical scandals in the Renaissance papacy prompted powerful movements for reform that ended unhappily in schism. In retrospect, the reforms were clearly necessary, but the schism deeply regrettable. In the modern age, Catholic Christianity has struggled with a series of world historical changes. The scientific revolution of the 17th century, the democratic revolutions in North America and France, the Industrial Revolution throughout Western Europe, the haunting specter of what in the 19th century was called the social question, the scandalous coexistence of luxury and misery within supposedly Christian countries and colonies. The first half of the 20th century brought virulent anti-Semitism, global depression, total war, and the use of atomic weapons. The second half brought the end of colonialism, a rebirth of feminism, and the promise and perils of a global economy. The Second Vatican Council, called by Pope John XXIII, was a welcome but belated response to these momentous historical events. Pope John summoned the Catholic Church to aggiornamento, to internal reform and renewal, and to an open and respectful dialogue with the nations and peoples of the modern world. Through the conciliar documents of the Second Council, the Second Vatican Council, the Church explicitly recognized its historicity. It described itself as the pilgrim people of God in history, moving through time with the aid of the Holy Spirit, and commanded by Christ through its teaching and practice to be lumen gentium, a light unto all the nations. The historical crises confronting the Church follow no simple pattern. Some of the challenges arose as the result of laudable human developments, the scientific and democratic revolutions, for example. Some were the result of internal decline within the Church's own house, the Babylonian captivity, and the scandals of the Renaissance papacy, among others. However, the rise of monasticism, the creation of the universities, the founding of new religious orders, the recurrence of conciliar movements for reform, provide ample evidence that the Church is capable of renewing itself from within. Christians believe rightly that the power of internal reform is the gift of the Holy Spirit. It is the historical presence of the Spirit within the Church as a whole that offers reason for hope when our common sins of pride, blindness, complacency, and inertia become sources of scandal rather than a summons to faith. In the 40 years since the formal close of Vatican II, the Catholic Church in the West has grown increasingly divided. For many faithful Catholics, the hope for reform and renewal raised by the Council have not been fulfilled. For other equally faithful Catholics, the opening to the modern world proclaimed in Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope, was insufficiently critical and discriminating. When the Church opened its windows to the contemporary world, one might say that both fresh air and pollution came in. Massive numbers of priests and religious have resigned their ministries. Even larger numbers of lay Catholics have left the Church altogether. The evident crisis in priestly and religious vocations has evoked a strong call for optional celibacy and the ordination of women. The Vatican's general response has been staunch opposition and a public effort to silence these mounting calls for change. The more resistant the Vatican appears to open critical dialogue, the less effective for many Catholics its authority becomes. Ironically, the repeated assertion of magisterial authority, in my judgment, has only weakened its hold on large sections of the Catholic community. This decline in effective authority that is really responded to, is not easily remediable, for it is rooted in two profound cultural currents moving through the contemporary Church. While the influence of these currents is not universal, in Western countries at least, it is undeniably strong and deep. Authority is not based on the possession of power, but on the exercise of legitimate power. Power has its source in human cooperation. Legitimacy is grounded in the reasons for cooperation. And we have a very candid, frank relationships. And the kinds of views I've been expressing tonight are not ones that they find shocking by any means. But you can tell how at odds, at least some of what I've said is, with what has been the public stance coming from Rome in the last 28 years. So I think there is that gap. Gary Wills argued in Papal Sin that it's that very gap that leads large numbers of priests to be publicly quiet about areas of disagreement because they don't want to be openly critical of their bishops, even as they, in their pastoral relationship with their parishioners, strike off in a very different tone. I should say, when I was 19 years old, I seriously considered becoming a priest. And there were two key reasons why I didn't. One, I searched my soul and I decided I wanted to marry and have a family, and that obviously wasn't consistent with the teaching then or now. But the other was, and this I owe to Notre Dame, I wanted to be able, whenever I spoke in public, to speak for myself. I didn't want to have to speak for someone else. I never have wanted to strike the apologetic note. Just is not, it's not connatural to me. Please.
Kind of on that note, why then should the church strike an apologetic note? It seems that you're against a lot of the more traditional standpoints of the church, but who's to say that the current social trends will hold? And since you've
think, Arlie, it's very important to distinguish what I would call levels of tradition. The heart of Catholic teaching, which we articulate each Sunday in our creeds, I'm not at all calling for change in that. To me, that's what I give my allegiance to, a certain conception of God as creator, a certain conception of Christ as redeemer, a certain conception of the Holy Spirit as renewer. And so many of the traditions of the church, I'm not calling for revision. I think, though, there are certain times in history where it's not a matter of just conforming to the age in which you live. If I gave that impression, that's not what I'm calling for. I tended to use, remember I said tradition and innovation, continuity and openness to constructive reform. What I'm struck by is that there are moments in history, and obviously I could read them incorrectly, where these are kairos moments where the church has to step up and make a decision about what is taking place at the present moment. So the French Revolution was one of those. The Industrial Revolution was the second one. The church did begin to address the ills, the injustices of the Industrial Revolution in its social encyclicals of the 19th century. Highly quoted around Boston College, Lonergan said they did this, okay, a little breathless and a little late. I think myself on the issue of full equality for women in the church, and I base this on personal experience of women I know and love who find the church not a spiritual home. But I also find it with young women whom I teach who have been Catholics and are finding it very hard to stay loyal to the church. I think this is one of those kairos moments. I don't think, I mean, to me, the issue of full equality for women in the larger secular society as well as in the church, to me, that's not a trend. That's not a passing fad. That's not a fashion. This is the moment. Just as it was the moment in the 1860s to address the issue of slavery, in my judgment, it's the moment now to address the question of full equality for women. That's how I read it.
Yes, please. As a follow-up from Arlie's question, Michael, what do you think of the new Pope's use of the term or the notion of moral relativism and the construct of that almost as a justification for not instituting certain changes?
Right. Well,
Not to put
no,
you on the
sir.
spot.
I was a short answer. I was very disappointed when Cardinal Ratzinger was chosen to be the Pope. That was my first reaction. But following the principle that you shouldn't judge something before you understand it, I started to read up more about Cardinal Ratzinger, and I'm still halfway along in that process. I think there is such a thing as moral relativism, so I don't want to say that Cardinal Ratzinger has completely fabricated an error to which he's opposing. But as I listened to his remarks, especially the remarks that he made just prior to his selection to be Pope, he used the term in such an umbrella fashion to me that it risked including anyone who just simply found themselves in disagreement with him. In other words, if you believe that some of the positions that the church takes are wrong, you're not a relativist. You believe in truth just as much as Cardinal Ratzinger believes in truth. You just think that the particular things that he has claimed as true are not true. That's why I said the question of credibility becomes so important, because the Catholic Church has always argued on lots of matters. You can give rational, persuasive arguments to people of goodwill about why one answer is better than another. The kinds of answers that I found in matters like Humanae Vitae, I mean, I just found them extremely unpersuasive in terms of the the actual concrete experience of people who want to have an enduring marriage, want to raise children, have children, but also want to allow both members of the couple to grow and flourish as human beings. I mean, the notion that every single act of conception had to be open to the birth of a child, I think, frankly, I don't mean to be rude, I think only a celibate could have conceived.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It has to do with the problem of democracy, which you well know, Tocqueville. In other words, there's a tremendous danger in democracy that it becomes a tyranny of the majority.
Right.
And we know that in our own country, et cetera.
Sure.
And one of the great things that made American democracy possible, Tocqueville points out, are institutions which aren't necessarily democratic. And I think in general, he describes American religion as non-democratic, and it certainly has been true of the church that made you a lifelong Democrat. And it was also true of your family. Families can't be democracies. And there's a certain sense in which we have a tendency to suppose that the only solution for authoritarian rule is democratic rule. But it seems to me that when I think of my own, as you have appealed to your experience, my own formation in the church had to do with meeting people who struck me as utterly free, priests and nuns and Catholic people. And there was a certain sense in which the freedom or their role in constituting the meaning that struck me as impressive didn't have to do with necessarily playing a role in power structures, and this is a problem. The church, I think, really did bureaucratize itself. Dennis Sheehan, who was the head of the liturgical implementation of the reforms of Vatican II in this diocese, and Joe Komanchak both said that never in the history of the entire church has there been such a bureaucratic mediation of liturgical change as occurred after Vatican II. And it's this bureaucratic exercise of authority which wasn't always the church. And it isn't the experience a lot of us who live in, so to speak, the interstices of the bureaucracy. What attracted us to the church, what made us try to be good Christians in the way that you talked about the gospel. So I wonder if there's, you're not suggesting that the church should democratize itself simply in the manner that, say, the younger Dick McBrien used to do. But have you thought about the ways that the church can be legitimately non-democratic, but still open and promoting freedom in the way that you're speaking?
Tocqueville's really interesting on this. Let's start with your first point. He actually says that one reason he thinks the Catholic Church will flourish in the United States is because he says, look, the principle of democracy is towards some notion of equality of condition, and that Catholicism believes in a great principle of equality of condition. There's God. Before God, we're all equal. And that principle needs to be kept constantly in mind. The second thing is that I'm at least as severe a critic of contemporary American democracy as I am of the exercise of governance within the church. So I'm certainly not talking about this dismal spectacle we conduct in Washington and every 4 years in the country at large as the model of what the church should be like. So I just want to get that off the table. Here's the way I see it. You mentioned the family's not a democracy. Authority presupposes inequality by its very nature, whether it's the inequality of a parent with regard to children or a teacher with regard to students. For that authority not to be formal, but for it to really work, I think two things have to be operative. those who are subject to it have to trust, children have to trust their parents, otherwise you can get children to do what you want to, but in doing so you lose their love. Teachers can use coercive measures to get students to come to class, but you can't make them learn. So that's why I'm stressing this concept of effective authority rather than formal authority. Now the third thing is, though, and this is what I think goes to the heart of what I'm trying to get at. As parents, we educate our children to become adults in their own right. The movement is towards responsible freedom on their part. It's certainly the same thing in the classroom. You know, at the end of 4 years, we let them go into the world. I mean, and both basically we hope that we did well enough that even though they'll continue to make mistakes as we did, they're ready enough for what's going on. What I want to see in the way the church exercises authority is something of that spirit, that it really is trying to actively engender the responsible freedom of its own members. And if you think of the parent-child or even the teacher-student relationship or the doctoral advisor, doctoral candidate, you're moving towards a greater relationship of equality. I mean, the commands that you give to your children when they're really little are very different from the advice that you give to them when they're 19 or 20 years old. The degree of direction that you have to take as a teacher with regard to freshman students is very different than the kind of invitation to becoming a peer that's characteristic of the way you work with more advanced students. So I want to see in the way the church exercises its authority something like calling us all to really more mature and responsible adulthood. Okay. That's why I say anything that smacks of paternalism is not going to work. But it's certainly not because I want to see the church conduct elections like
The Episcopal Church.
But look, the fact of the matter is, I mean, I was asked about Cardinal Ratzinger. One reason Cardinal Ratzinger's appointment was not surprising is that the Pope had appointed the cardinals who would choose him as people who were essentially like-minded. This is a very diverse church, and how much was that diversity represented in the choosing body internal to our own structures?
Well, last week, Bill Murnian talked about the just war, and just before that, Pope Benedict XVI was quoted as saying several times he didn't think in today's world the just war was possible. This week you said a lot of things that Pope Benedict XVI, when he was the Peritus for Cardinal Frings, he wrote a paper against the Holy Office, saying exactly what it was causing a crisis of credibility in the church, using the same criteria that you used. So he's a lot more like Pope Benedict XVI than he would like to believe.